Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Tara, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm the program manager for the school mental health team at the Southeast Mhgtc, based in Atlanta, Georgia. If you haven't already done so, we invite you to introduce yourself in the chat box. And I also encourage you to turn on your camera so we can see each other's faces and build community. I'd like to remind everyone to mute themselves when you're not speaking. We encourage you to use the chat to share resources, participate in discussions, and communicate with us if you have any audio or technical issues. We have made every attempt to make today's presentation secure. If we need to end the presentation unexpectedly, we will follow up using your registration information email. At the end of this session, we'll ask you to complete a brief survey that is required by our funder, SAMHSA. And this is really important to us and will only take 1 to 2 minutes to complete. This anonymous data we collect from you will help us improve our future programming. All right, a quick introduction to the Mhgtc in case you're not familiar. The Mhgtc network is comprised of 13 centers across the US, including 10 regional centers, a National American Indian and Alaska Native Center, a National Hispanic and Latino Center, and a network coordinating office. In August of 2018, each Mhgtc received supplemental funding to address the need for further implementation of mental health services in school systems. The Mhgtc centers are providing direct TA and training on the implementation of mental health services in schools and school systems, providing training and TA on the importance of mental health service provisions in school and linkages to such services where direct provision is not possible, and disseminating information related to best models of school-based mental health provision, including ways in which these models can be implemented. If you'd like to learn more, we encourage you to explore the Mhgtc website, which you can find in the chat box. If you're not connected to your regional Mhgtc already, we hope you'll visit their website and reach out to the center that serves you. And we have a quick disclaimer. So I just want to remind you all that the views, opinions, and content expressed in this presentation do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policies of the Center for Mental Health Services, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. This community is hosted by the Mhgtc Network's Healing Racial Violence Teamlet. Our goal is to build a network of support among school communities that strengthens our capacity to lead in challenging racial violence while forging school cultures and climates of healing and wellness. This community of practice is made possible by so many people, including all of you participants, as well as our incredible facilitators. We hope you will engage with us through the chat box and Q&A throughout the session. Today's meeting is session 2 of 7 gatherings for our community of practice. And today's session is going to be facilitated by Tiffany Marie, and it's titled Beyond Schooling Towards Models of Education and Youth Protection. As we set the context for today's session, we'd like to elevate the community norms and ways of engaging that our COP has committed to uphold. The Mhgtc network uses affirming, respectful, and recovery-oriented language in all activities. We ask that you follow these guidelines when participating. If there are any other things you might need from our community to feel open and present, we invite you to share them now. If at any point you have a need surrounding one of our community norms, please feel free to reach out to Christy in the private chat. And without further ado, I will hand it to you, Tiffany.
Greetings, everyone. Seems like we have folks from around the nation represented today. So grateful and humbled to be here with everyone. I just want to walk through a little bit of what you should expect today. In a second, we're going to screen a film that really explores these ideas of what it means to move beyond schooling toward really transformative models of education for young people. We'll engage in a discussion, a short discussion afterward, feelings and reactions to the film. We'll then jump into a specific case study that is centered around very specific experiences that I had that show up in the film that I think will also are pretty vital in what it means to shift in these models. Just one smaller example of what could arise. We'll talk about it and then we'll discuss in breakout rooms and then we'll come back for a closing. And so as we move to this next slide, before we get into the film, I do want to ground us a little bit more, and hopefully where you are, your feet can be literally planted somewhere, and that you're able to be mindful of your breath work as we do this. But the grounding quote that I want to invite us to think about is this idea of suffering is in the attachment. And this comes from, profound and wise elders, particularly around, it is not to say that we have the ability to escape suffering necessarily in our lifetimes, but sometimes it is unnecessary. And we think about schools and schooling. Part of what we want to think about is the ways in which we are attaching ourselves to certain aspects that contribute to our suffering. I invite you all to actually develop your own interpretation of this and utilize the chat for the next 2 minutes to share potentially what comes up for you when you read this quote. The suffering is in the attachment. And I'll just share back some responses as they come. What comes to you when you read this? The suffering is in the attachment.
Tiffany, is it okay if I unmute and share, or did you want us to use the chat box? I'm sorry.
Please.
Something that comes to mind for me when I hear that phrase is a story that I read in a book about joy. And the gentleman was riding his motorcycle and he cut his leg. And he stopped in a village. There was no hospitals and there was no hospital where he was riding his bike. He stopped in a village and they said that they didn't have the appropriate supplies to treat his wound and that he would need to drive to the nearest hospital so that they could numb his leg before they sewed it up. And he said, well, no, I don't have time to do that. Just sew my leg up without the numbing material. And so the doctor did, and the guy held a conversation with him the whole time. And after it was over, the doctor said, wasn't that awful? Like, wasn't that horribly painful? And the guy said, yeah, pain is sort of an inevitable part of life, but suffering is like a conscious choice. It's like my choice. And I chose to acknowledge the pain, but not to suffer through this experience.
Wow. What a great grounding, especially as we, thank you so much, as we think about this and the agency that we have. The pain is inevitable, but the suffering in many ways is connected to our agency and some of the choices that we have the ability to make. And we're gonna show a film actually that's gonna take up about, and fire is just showing up in this chat. So please y'all scroll through that as I'm introducing the film. So much of what you're gonna see today is gonna take up about 26 minutes of our time together, is a film that I both produce, but also follows my, I feel like my teaching for the last 8 years at least, and is a reflection of some of the work and important learnings that we've had. And a lot of the suffering that we were experiencing and a lot of the suffering that our young people also were experiencing was our attachment to this very specific framework of how young people learn, what it looks like, and through particularly the lens of schooling. And this film is going to follow in detail what it meant for us to allow certain aspects of it, to be frank, to die. It's named after the children's story, The People Could Fly. And we've altered the title to read The Children Could Fly. So without further ado, I hope the audio and such is solid, but here is this short film. Welcome back. Welcome back. I want to take a little bit of time to debrief and make sense of what's coming up for folks. And before we weren't able to show the slide, but I dropped in the chat kind of 3 things that I was hoping folks were doing throughout the film, which was thinking about the parts that resonate, the parts that challenge you, that maybe felt uncomfortable, and then questions came up. And I'd love to dive into that right now, as some folks may want to do a little bit more breath work to ground themselves and make sense of it. I do want to move in and lead further and first talk about, I want to switch it up a little bit. I'm interested in, because I think the chat is like, wow, quotes. And I think that's part of the culture. It's very celebratory culture, which feels great. And then we'll have these sessions and then our society is consistently reproduced. So there's something happening that we aren't engaging in. So I'd actually like to spend a little bit of time around focusing on parts of the film that were challenging and that felt uncomfortable or that we have difficulty sitting with first. And I'd love for folks to both utilize the chat and also unmute themselves. So the first is what were some elements that were actually challenging for folks to sit with? So there's some in the chat around sadness that certain young folks don't get to learn in this way. Some have shared that it may be challenging for teachers and that some folks are stuck with grades and rubrics and checklists. Thank you so much. Others, the way children are treated in KIPP schools. I think KIPP is like the South to me. They're just have been a little bit more transparent with the way they treat children. I think other schools harm children in nicer ways, but the harm is still there. Acknowledgement of historical trauma, family trauma, and hardships. It's this knowing that our students feel unappreciated due to not living up to certain standards in school because of where they come from. Others share it's challenging to see the impact of intergenerational trauma. Yeah, definitely. Any others? Challenging moments?
Actually, I have something to say. I think about that piece where we have these systems that harm children, and I think about what my role has been in those systems, and I think that's that piece that's really hard, is that even when we have good intentions, I've probably played a role in that piece as well. So definitely like spending some time thinking about that and how we move systems in a different way. Because even when we have good intentions, it doesn't mean we're not doing harm because we're also operating in that system.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Shared about the necessity for this type of education, but how it is, and the block, particularly by adults in our operating systems. There's some work around what it means for white folks to engage in this, particularly around ancestral work. That traditional learning is not enough. Some folks have shared knowing, there's a knowing that we send our to an educational system that breaks their spirits. from a working mother, there's sadness to know the school system could potentially break their son's spirit. There's commentary about the white supremacist system, that every student is harmed, and that's hard, and some more than others. The relationship between education and health, the challenge that students are not able to heal in the ways that are most soothing for them. Learning styles being stifled, and that's impact on their health and the lack of support. And that schools alone cannot heal society and its children. Thank you all. Let's go, let's flip it. What are some of the parts of the film that may have resonated with folks? And it would be great if some people would be willing to unmute themselves and share as well.
I really like to see, it gave me hope to see the change in the young people's perceptions from start to finish, and like how, and just the affirmation that when people are given the tools, that they very much want to be an active participant in their healing.
Thank you so much. Maybe one or two more parts that resonate with people, if one or two people are willing to share aloud.
Hello. Hello.
Yes, we can hear you, Joseph.
Okay, thank you so much. My name is Joseph from all the way from Kenya, and I'm a member of Kadke, a friend of Deborah Princess, and
Uh-oh, Joseph, we may have lost you, but we'll be excited for if you return. And as we're waiting for Joseph, maybe one more person is willing to unmute.
Tiffany, this is Karen. Good afternoon. Something that resonated with me is it's really wonderful that the students got the education. Their parents saw the impact of that, but how can we turn that so therefore we don't have to wait for the students to teach us? How can we work on us that can really impact and help them to continue to fly? Because we are part of the system also, so we also need to be equally educated and informed so that we don't stifle them because we haven't really unpacked our own baggage.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate that. I'm not going to attempt to answer that. I think there's going to be a lot of time that's embedded in the actual case study that's coming next that connects greatly to what you're sharing. So I'm super grateful for you bringing that up. In these, we got about 4 minutes for this slot left. And I do want to open up space if there are any questions that folks had around the film.
Where can we access it? Is there a link? Where can we get a copy?
So great question. Right now, the film The Children Could Fly is screening for the spring right now. It's not released yet. This is a rare circumstance. We're screening it at a few different places and festivals. The official release will probably be around May or June of this year. But right now, we're just showing it to very specific audiences. It's called The Children Could Fly, and it will, I think my information will be available, so we'll be able to share both.
Are we already on a list if we're part of this training?
We can make that happen for sure.
Okay.
Other questions? Thank you for that one.
I have a question, Tiffany. Maybe as like a year 1 to 5 teacher, 1st to 5th year teaching in a large comprehensive school, how might I start to create this kind of culture and exchange within my classroom or my specific domain within schooling? What
That's
can
a
I
great question. That's a great question. And I always share with folks that I've never done any of this alone. And so as early as my, first years of teaching, it's always been in partnership with folks. And now we just explicitly, whether it's my college courses or program courses, I teach with at least 3 or 4 people. And our model, and I think I would push school communities to incorporate this, our model has always been where we have prospective teachers who are studying these frameworks. And so when we travel to New Zealand, when we travel to, there's no way we could have done most of these trips, particularly with just us. We would always have folks who are at other high schools who are volunteering, some who are now in teacher ed programs, which is really cool to show this, to talk about this work, and then they see themselves in some of those pictures when they were in high school and who are now teachers. And then always partnered with the universities that I'm teaching at. And so those folks would come and always volunteer. So it wasn't always folks jumping right into this work. They've always been mentored through the process. I don't actually suggest people do this alone, and especially in their first few years. I always suggest that this is done in partnership with veteran teachers, elders, and community so that people can be held in the process. There's a lot of risk taking involved. There's a lot of challenging that's involved, structural challenges where you'll just get fired. And whereas when we've done a lot of this work, we've leveraged a lot of power. And so folks were, which is, going into our case study, we're highly upset that we went to New Zealand, our school community. They didn't comment on the fact that children traveled around the world and were able to have a life-changing experience. They were bothered that their day-to-day realities were disrupted. Those were the emails that I was getting while we were out there. And that was the energy that I came back to. But it was also really powerful for them to know that most of the people who went on the trip with us were folks I recruited to our school. And so while they can be upset, if that many people left, that school would be in deep trouble. And so we always try to talk about leveraging. It was about 10 of us, about 10 adults. It's about leveraging power as well in doing this. And I think a lot of folks have been mentored in the past. You're just going to be without a job, and the kids are going to be without a teacher who started these relationships with them. Whereas, how do we do this work where we are building capacity, leveraging power, and shifting? And in the past, I've only seen the former, where young people see these powerful frameworks, and then they also see this is what the result of that is. And that's actually not the message that we're hoping to send to our young people in our communities. It's actually that these spaces can be transformed, they're flexible, and there are frameworks to do that. And we're not the only folks who embody or practice these frameworks. I was mentored to do the very same thing. Many of the first, the iteration of this work when I was in grad school was studying these same models with mentors of mine as well. I hope that comes close to answering that. Okay, so right now we're going to transition and think about, again, how to engage some of this work. And so in just a second, you'll be in smaller groups to have discussion around it. And as you engage, after these slides, I'm going to actually introduce a case study. But in prepping for that, after I introduce it, you'll be in smaller groups. You have opportunity to introduce yourselves and hopefully get someone to take notes in that space. And then there will be a discussion moderator who will pose 3 questions. And in that time, you'll have about 15 minutes to discuss. And then we'll come back as a whole group where we'll share out what you come up with, possible solutions, ways of furthering inquiries that come up, and hopefully some type of implications or significance as it relates to healing school communities, okay? And we're hoping that as you think about this, a lot of our work and what's fascinating, and I'm so grateful in this that we didn't spend the majority of the time talking about telomeres, and people seem to be excited about that, whereas this group, which was really beautiful to read and to hear, was actually more focused on ancestral practices, the healing, the grounded work, the connection to nature. So that gives me a lot of hope. And our work pulls in a public health framework, but it is a tool, it is not the entire thing. And so as we think about this work, we're using a very particular public health framework as a tool, as a lens to dive deeper, but not it in its entirety. And so as you move through your discussion, we're hoping that you can think about this in different realms, using this as a way to think about it at an individual level, the ways in which these dynamics show up amongst community and place, and how that influences your responses, your analysis about this as it relates to systems and institutions. And then, of course, in this larger context, the histories that characterize what we are experiencing today, the legacies and structures that both compromise our wellness, but also can inform how we can make sense of healing and moving forward. Okay. So here's a scenario, here's a case study. Let's say you've organized a trip to New Zealand with several youth in your advisory to study Maori projects of cultural reclamation. Imagine that. And teachers within yours not want youth to attend because their grades are too low to take on what they call extracurricular activities. This is your case study. And so before you dive into that, and we'll actually drop that in the chat too, so people have that case study. And before we break into these smaller groups, is there anything that folks feel like would help them to better understand the challenge or contextualize this a little bit better? I'm gonna pull up the chat. Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question around graduation. Like, is this close to graduation? Are they seniors? Will that be compromised if they go on this trip?
Let's say that there's you know what, I don't want to do that. Let's say that's just the conversation. It's their freshman year. It's not related to graduation, but this is the argument.
Are there opportunities to help them catch up before the trip?
Y'all are making this not a case study, but a reality. I'm gonna opt out of answering that and for you to use, because I think that ask that one more time, because I might be misunderstanding the question.
Are there opportunities to help them catch up before the trip?
Sure. Actually, I'll make it harder. Let's say no, there aren't. Which I think will make the conversation a little bit more juicy. Let's say that there are not.
Hi, I have a question. I mean, this might be one of those, making it too much of a reality. The funding for this, is there any funding that, that they need to get up their grades, or are you going to are they going to depend this on the next year, like how they do this year, things like that?
All that's taken care of. You and your advisory are solid. You have this trip plan. Kids are excited about it, and then it's their teachers, their other teachers who have issue with them being able to attend, and who are seeking to prevent that as a result of their grades. And so there's two aspects here that I'm hoping folks can dive into: this idea of grades and them being too low, and then the other aspect of this being contextualized as an extracurricular activity. Okay. All right, so I think now we're gonna go ahead and open those rooms for folks to jump in. Okay, do we have everyone back, or are we still waiting for a few groups?
It looks like we have everybody back, Tiffany.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. We're gonna take a few more minutes to debrief what came up in your small group discussion. And I'd love to know from folks, like, what you thought about, felt, or heard within that time that might be powerful to raise to this full group. Anybody willing to share?
I could share out a little bit for group 7. I don't think I necessarily captured everything, but a couple things that came up were just sort of thinking about how not letting the students go is really creating a barrier in limiting students, and not really placing value on the possible learning that could happen, whether it's like the learning about the culture in New Zealand and the people that are there, the relationships that would be formed through going through that kind of experience with other people from the school. And just like how that might further their own curiosity and intellectual development, that when they come back, that's going to just sort of like stimulate them even more to really kind of like engage in more learning. And the other thing that kind of came up for me as well was just thinking about like being, I guess, as like a school or teachers really being more reflective on their own practice and thinking about why are the students' grades low, and like if they're disengaged, where is that coming from, and is it the students failing or is it us failing the students?
Great points. Thank you so much, Jeff. Others, ideas that emerged within your group discussion.
So less deep, like there was some practical. I love that educators are also practical. There was some like, well, maybe those teachers, when we got to the third questions about how to address this dilemma, it's like, well, maybe those teachers could instead come up with some creative ways for those kids to learn the knowledge while they were on the trip. And Kathy shared a good one. She thought of like in 30 seconds was like, I don't know, why not like have them convert kilometers to miles and think about the metric system, and then you've covered math and science. And I was like, yeah, you're right. And that took like 3 minutes. And then we also had a really nice conversation about like, what is success? Whose standards are we using to measure success? And then how those, like what we saw in the video, Tiffany, those standards of success have historically, when we thought about the bigger one, been used as tools of harm, and to recognize that as part of the present.
So good. Thank you so much. Maybe from 2 more people.
I said I would share some things from our group, and I really want to start and then call on Kara to wrap up, if you would be so kind to, Kara. One of the things that we felt we heard was a big difference in the value systems between individual and interpersonal, all the way up to history, legacy, and structure, and how mentioning power building and how bringing in influential players from those larger groups and bringing those down in to have an effect, because of viewing this as being something that is extracurricular in itself versus foundational for somebody's future and their beginning their education in, if it's high school, if we're starting with the freshmen. Kara put it into such beautiful words, but it kind of simmered down to being a big clash of values that we identified as being what the dilemma was.
We had an idea about that dilemma in our group, is that taking it to prove to this group of teachers or administrators why this is necessary, using a previous cohort and showing how their grades or social emotional learning improved after they went on the trip. So showing them that this did have a benefit, that it was helping their, their grades and their bottom line, what they're concerned about. We talked about how we're trying to dismantle that system, but we still are working in that system. So how do we use that system against them? How do we make them understand that, by allowing this and this growth, you're then going to see the things that you're not seeing right now.
Such great points. And I always hear folks talk about institutions, but we make up the institutions. And the more folks who are, there's so much that happens with our consent to young people that's both harmful and disruptive, transformative. So I really appreciate this idea of what happens in these spaces. And a lot of times has a lot to do with our agency as adults and what we center and what we value. And what we value, we push forward. This has been amazing. I think as we close today, I'm going to, let's move past that one because I think folks have shared a little bit. And yeah, in our closing practice today, what I want to do is some of the work that we've done with our young people around embodying. So it's one thing, I think schools are so heady and have done a really great job of disconnecting us from our bodies. We're really good at that. And part of what we believe education to be is a reconnection to our bodies and an understanding and valuing the sacredness of who we are and us being complete just as we are. And so I want to close with that and hopefully ground us in being able to tap into our intuition, to listen to what our bodies are sharing, that will ultimately guide our closing reflection. So I'm gonna invite you, if you feel comfortable, to either mute your screen or to close your eyes. Either way, I invite you to close your eyes and ground yourselves, your feet, and hopefully situate your hands somewhere, maybe on your lap, if that feels good for you. And in a second, I'm gonna invite us to take 2 collective breaths. And when we breathe in, I'm gonna count for 4 seconds. I'm gonna have us hold for 6 seconds and then release for 8 seconds. And we'll do that twice, okay? So if you join me in breathing in right now for 1, 2, 3, 4, and hold your breath for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and now release for 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. And we're going to take one more collective breath. Let's breathe in for 1, 2, 3, 4, and hold for 6 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and now release for 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Please continue breathing in a pattern that feels good for you with eyes closed. I just want you to be mindful of the way in which your chest rises and the ways in which it falls. There's wisdom there. And as you're continuing in that rhythm that feels good for you, that feels connected to you, I would push you to also be mindful of where you can feel the messages that came forward today in certain parts of your body. Whether there's certain tension in your neck, whether there's sensation in your shoulders, your ears. And I invite you to also breathe into that, into those spaces. And as you're breathing, I'm going to share some ideas that I'd love for you to work through your breath work. And that is based on all that has been said today, all that you've experienced in today's session. There may be one point of entry, one takeaway that your body is communicating to you right now. And I want you to feel that and experience that. What's one takeaway? that your body may be sharing with you. And that may be something around slowness. It may be something around values. It may be something around the sacredness of people. But I want you to listen to your bodies on that. And then when it feels good for you, when it feels safe, I invite you to turn back, open your eyes, unmute your screen. And if you're willing, utilize the chat and or unmute yourself and share one major takeaway from this session today.
Well, I'm glad to know that we come from different area, and knowing that we have similar problem in our community with our students. We're able to share a little bit about teachers and students, the grade, falling behind are very similar in all the different region of the United States. And so I was able to share with the group. I'm happy. I want to share because I think a lot of us in the group also work with young people. So I think that being able to just let the world know what's going on, that's important. And
thank you. Oh, I'm sorry, please continue. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now I'm gonna note as we close a quote that comes out of the chat that says, attachment, going back to our grounding quote, attachment operates outside our conscious awareness. But the more we make it conscious, the more opportunity we have to make choices that align with our values. I really appreciate that. And what a great way to end. There's been some asks about the how to stay connected to some of this work. Oh, I'm putting up this. There's two organizations that were centered in the film that I'm a part of. First of which is H2O, and then the other is Apocalyptic Education. Thank you so much, and I'm going to hand it back over.
Thanks so much, Tiffany, and thank you everyone for participating in the breakout sessions and in the discussion today. If we go back a couple slides, we have some like homework type thing for you to do some reflection and journaling if you want to. So we have some questions for you to ponder and be in conversation with your community, or like I said, journaling. So you can take a picture of this if you want, or we'll be posting the slides, and feel free to write it directly into the Jamboard on the designated page or in your own journal. And you can upload text, images, poetry, video clips, or anything else that you want to. It's a good way to connect with the people in this community as well. All right, thanks for going back to that slide. And so the next session is going to be on Tuesday, February 22nd. If you haven't already registered for that, you can go to the landing page, and that's where all of the resources that were shared in the session will be located, and where you can register for all of the upcoming events in this series, in this community of practice, rather. Okay, and so we are gathering case studies to use for discussion like the one we used today. And we welcome you to share a dilemma that's related to racial violence that you experienced or witnessed in your school. We would anonymize it, and you can email it to Ricky And the email is on the slide here. And Ricky, if you wouldn't mind putting your email into the chat box as well. And then super important is our evaluation. So before we wrap up today, before we close today, we have a really important request from you. So funding for our services comes from SAMHSA, and they require us to collect evaluations from our participants. We've shared a link in the chat box to our very short survey that we're asking you to fill out. It should really only take about a minute to complete, and it is an opportunity for you to give us some feedback about this event, and it assists us in planning future meetings and programs. And then finally, if you aren't already connected with your regional MHTTC, we encourage you to visit our website, mhttcnetwork.org, and reach out to your regional center. We also encourage you to explore the website and view the resources created by the entire network on there. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next on the 22nd.